You're standing at the edge of a river 50,000 years ago. Your hands are shaking, but not from cold. Beside you sits a girl. She's 12 years old. And in 3 days, everyone in this camp will treat her like an adult, not because she wants to grow up fast, not because anyone forced a decision on her overnight, but because out here, in a world without medicine, without safety nets, without tomorrow guaranteed, 12 years old was already halfway through her life. That sentence should stop you. Halfway through her life, not the beginning. Not childhood extended for years the way we know it today. Halfway. This isn't a story about ancient cruelty. It's a story about ancient math. Brutal, cold, terrifyingly logical math that shaped nearly every early human society on Earth. And once you understand the numbers, you'll never look at growing up the same way again. Here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. Why would evolution, a process that usually protects the young, push human bodies toward parenthood so early? The answer isn't simple. It isn't comfortable. And it's not what most people assume. Let's start with a number that changes everything. In most hunter-gatherer societies before agriculture, average life expectancy hovered between 18 and 30 years old. Not because people mysteriously dropped dead at 30 like clockwork, but because childhood itself was a minefield. Nearly half of all children born didn't survive to see their 5th birthday. Disease, infection, predators, starvation, accidents. Any one of these could end a life before it truly began. If you managed to survive childhood, congratulations. You'd already outlived nearly half the people born alongside you. But surviving childhood didn't mean you were safe. It meant the clock had simply started ticking louder. Picture this. You're 15 years old in a small hunter-gatherer band. You've already watched siblings die of fever. You've watched adults die from infected wounds that today would need nothing more than antibiotics. You understand, on some primal level most modern teenagers never have to face. That time is not guaranteed. Now here's the twist that scientists didn't expect. This wasn't just cultural pressure. It was written into the biology itself. But here's what scientists actually found when they started studying skeletal remains and comparing them to modern human development. Puberty in ancient populations often arrived earlier, not later, than many assumed. Harsh conditions, paradoxically, sometimes accelerated biological maturity rather than delaying it. Why would a stressed, resource-scarce body rush toward reproduction instead of playing it safe? Doesn't that sound backwards? This is where evolutionary biologists point to something called life history theory. It sounds academic, but the idea is brutally simple. When environments are unpredictable and life is short, bodies unconsciously shift strategy. Instead of investing years into growth and safety, biology gambles on reproducing sooner. Because waiting might mean never getting a chance at all. Your body, in other words, doesn't know about modern healthcare. It doesn't know about clean water or vaccines or emergency rooms. Deep in your genetic code is a strategy written by ancestors who learned, generation after generation, that waiting could mean die without ever passing anything forward. Sit with that for a second. The instinct to rush toward adulthood wasn't recklessness. It was a survival algorithm running in the background of the human body for hundreds of thousands of years. This is where the first major reframe comes in. Because everything you thought you knew about childhood as a universal human experience is wrong. Childhood, the version we know today, years of school protection, delayed responsibility, is not the ancient default. It's a relatively recent invention. For most of human history, the line between child and adult wasn't a birthday. It was capability. Could you gather food without supervision? Could you help defend the camp? Could you contribute to the survival of the group? If the answer was yes, society had little use of the concept of not ready yet. Readiness wasn't measured in years. It was measured in usefulness and biological maturity. This is uncomfortable for modern minds to hear, because we built an entire culture around extending childhood as long as possible. And for very good reason. Modern childhood protections exist because we finally can afford them. We have the medicine, the food security, the safety nets that ancient humans never had. But understanding why ancient societies operated differently isn't the same as endorsing it. It's about understanding the brutal calculus of survival that shaped human behavior for tens of thousands of years, a calculus most of us, thankfully, will never have to face. Here's the piece that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies found that community structure, not just biology, played the biggest role in determining norms around early family formation. Extended family networks, shared childcare, and communal food gathering meant that young people were never navigating adulthood alone. A 12-year-old in an ancient community wasn't an isolated individual making decisions in a vacuum. She was surrounded by grandmothers, aunts, older cousins, an entire web of support built specifically to compensate for young age and inexperience. Anthropologists call this the grandmother hypothesis, and it might be one of the most underrated forces in human evolutionary history. Why do human females, uniquely among most mammals, live decades past their reproductive years? The leading theory is startling. Grandmothers who survived past menopause weren't biologically done. They became the safety net. They gathered food, taught skills, cared for grandchildren, and freed up younger mothers to have children more frequently and more successfully. This changes the picture entirely. Early parenthood wasn't a lone teenager thrown into impossible responsibility. It was one link in a chain of communal survival, with older generations absorbing much of the burden that modern nuclear families place entirely on two parents. Isn't it strange how something we assume was a burden was actually distributed across an entire village? This connects to something modern psychology still grapples with today. Ancient humans lived in what researchers call alloparenting societies, child-rearing shared across many adults, not confined to biological parent alone. Compare that to modern Western parenting, where isolated nuclear families often raise children with minimal outside support, and researchers have found significantly higher rates of parental burnout and anxiety. Here's the first connection to modern psychology worth sitting with. Humans may be biologically wired to expect a village, not a household of two. When that village disappears, the psychological weight of parenting increases dramatically, and studies on postpartum mental health consistently point to social isolation as one of the strongest predictors of struggle. We didn't evolve for the nuclear family. We evolved for the network. And ancient early parenthood only worked because that network existed. Now let's talk about what scientists found when they examined ancient teeth and bones, because the evidence here is stranger than fiction. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletal remains from prehistoric sites use a method called dental and skeletal age estimation to determine how old individuals were when they died and when they began reproducing. Growth plates, tooth eruption patterns, and pelvic bone changes all leave permanent evidence. What they found in numerous ancient populations was a pattern of first pregnancies occurring earlier than modern medical guidelines would ever recommend today. Not universally. Not in every culture, but common enough that researchers began asking why this pattern repeated across unrelated societies on different continents, with no contact between them. That's the piece that should make you pause. If this were just one culture's tradition, you could chalk it up to local customs. But when isolated populations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas independently arrived at similar patterns, something bigger than culture is at play. That's biology and environment converging on the same brutal solution. But here's what scientists actually found next, and this is where the story gets darker. Early parenthood came at an enormous physical cost. Skeletal remains show clear evidence of pelvic stress, malnutrition, and complications consistent with pregnancy in still developing bodies. Maternal mortality in ancient societies wasn't a rare tragedy. It was one of the leading causes of death for young women. Some estimates suggest that in certain prehistoric and early agricultural societies, complications related to childbirth killed more young women than warfare, disease, or accidents combined. Think about that. The single most dangerous thing a person could do in ancient life, statistically more dangerous than hunting a large predator, was carrying and delivering a child. This wasn't a footnote in ancient life. It was one of the defining risks of being human. So why would evolution push bodies towards something so dangerous? This is the paradox at the center of everything we've discussed. And the answer forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about how evolution actually works. Evolution doesn't care about your well-being. It doesn't care about your safety, your happiness, or your quality of life. Evolution only cares about one metric. Did your genes make it to the next generation? Everything else, comfort, longevity, health, is irrelevant to the cold math of natural selection unless it happens to also improve reproductive success. This is the second major connection to modern psychology, and it's an unsettling one. Many of our modern instincts, urgency around relationships, anxiety about falling behind in life milestones, even biological clocks, are echoes of survival algorithm built for a world where waiting can mean dying without offspring. Your brain still runs some of that ancient code, even in a world where the original danger no longer applies. Ever felt an irrational sense of urgency about life decisions that logically shouldn't feel urgent? That feeling has ancient roots. It's a survival mechanism firing in a world it was never designed for. Now we arrive at the halfway point of the story, and this is where the picture most people have in their heads gets completely dismantled. What you're about to hear was largely left out of mainstream history books because it complicates a narrative people prefer. The idea that ancient life was simple, natural, and somehow more pure than modern existence. It wasn't. It was a constant negotiation between biological drives, brutal environmental pressure, and communal survival strategies that modern society has almost entirely lost. Here's the part that gets buried the most. Early reproduction wasn't celebrated as some romantic milestone the way pop culture sometimes imagines ancient life. In most documented small-scale societies, it was treated as a serious, high-risk event requiring the support of experienced women, midwives, grandmothers, elder aunts who had witnessed enough childbirth to recognize danger signs early. Entire social rituals developed around protecting young mothers during this vulnerable period. Special foods reserved for pregnant girls. Isolation huts designed to prevent infection. Rest periods enforced by community elders, even in societies where every other adult worked constantly for survival. These weren't small gestures. They represented enormous resource investment from communities that had almost nothing to spare. Why would resource-starved societies dedicate so much toward protecting young mothers if it were simple, easy, or biologically designed to be safe? The amount of protective ritual built around this period is itself evidence of how dangerous and difficult it actually was. This is the uncomfortable truth hiding beneath the surface. Ancient societies didn't treat early parenthood as ideal. They treated it as a dangerous necessity, dictated by mortality rates and short lifespans, that required every possible layer of communal protection to survive. It wasn't romanticized. It was managed like a crisis. Let's push further into the evidence, because there's a piece of the story that even seasoned anthropologists find genuinely shocking. Researchers studying isotopic analysis, chemical signatures left behind in bones from diet and environmental exposure, have been able to reconstruct surprisingly detailed pictures of ancient family life. What they found was that in many societies, the actual age gap between partners was often far larger than modern assumptions suggest, with older, established adults pairing with younger individuals specifically because survival experience mattered more than age similarity. This wasn't about preference. It was about competence. An experienced hunter or gatherer who had survived multiple seasons, who understood which plants were poisonous, who knew how to read weather patterns and animal movement. That knowledge was survival currency. Pairing younger, less experienced individuals with older, proven survivors increased the odds that both partners and any children would live. Harsh? Yes. Also, in the cold logic of survival, effective. Ancient social structures weren't optimizing for romance. They were optimizing for the continuation of the group. This brings us to the third connection to modern psychology, and it might be the most surprising one yet. Modern research on human attraction has repeatedly found that people unconsciously value traits associated with competence, resource access, and stability in long-term partners. Patterns that echo, faintly but measurably, the survival logic of ancient pairing structures. We like to think modern attraction is purely about chemistry, personality, spontaneous connection. But underneath the surface, some psychologists argue we're still running partial versions of ancient survival calculations, just applied to a world where survival itself is no longer the primary concern. Isn't it strange how much of what feels like personal choice is actually ancient programming wearing a modern disguise? Now, let's move toward the final and most disturbing layer of this story, the part most documentaries skip entirely, because it's simply too uncomfortable to sit with. The most shocking scientific finding in this entire area of research isn't about age. It's about consequence. Researchers studying skeletal remains of young mothers across multiple ancient sites found something researchers didn't initially expect: evidence of repeated, chronic physical trauma from childbirth occurring in bodies that hadn't finished their own skeletal development. Pelvic bones in modern humans don't fully mature until the early 20s. In ancient remains showing evidence of childbirth in much younger individuals, researchers found signs of significant strain, bone deformation, heel fractures around the pelvis, and other markers consistent with bodies forced to endure something they weren't yet fully built to handle. This is a reveal that changes the emotional tone of this entire story. Early parenthood in ancient societies wasn't a clever evolutionary hack that worked out fine because of biological readiness. For many individuals, it was a physically brutal ordeal that left permanent damage, and, in a significant number of documented cases, ended in death. The romanticized version of ancient life doesn't include this part, but the bones don't lie. And what they tell us is one of the darkest, most overlooked truths in human evolutionary history. The survival strategy that allowed humanity to continue was built, in part, on the suffering of very young bodies forced to carry burdens they weren't fully developed to bear. This isn't a story of ancient people being reckless or uncaring. Communities clearly tried to protect their youngest mothers with every resource available. But even with every protective ritual, every midwife, every extended family member helping, biology imposed limits that ancient medicine simply couldn't overcome. It's a sobering thought. The very trait that allowed the human species to expand across every continent on Earth, rapid, early reproduction in the face of brutal mortality rates, came at a devastating individual cost that history books rarely acknowledge. So why does this matter now? Why should any of this change how you think about your own life, thousands of years removed from these pressures? Because understanding ancient survival math reveals something profound about how far human life has actually come. For nearly all of human history, reaching 30 years old made you elderly by population standards. Watching your own children survive past childhood was never guaranteed. Every stage of growing up carried a level of physical risk that modern humans, for the most part, will never have to face. The extended childhood we now consider normal, years of protected growth, education, delayed responsibility, isn't a luxury humans have always had. It's an extraordinary, historically unusual privilege built on modern medicine, food security, and social safety nets that our ancestors could never have imagined. Next time you think about how long modern life takes to figure things out, how many years people now spend growing, learning, delaying big decisions, remember this: that extra time isn't wasted. It's the result of finally escaping a survival math so brutal. It once required childhood itself to end early just to keep the species alive. We didn't evolve to live slowly. We evolved to survive urgently. And only now, for the first time in human history, do most of us get the chance to actually grow up before life demands everything from us.